So first of all, I want to welcome everyone to Los Angeles City Historical Society. My name is Danny Jensen. I'm the program's chair, and we're excited to tonight have a special webinar with Pamela Prickett, who is an acclaimed author and associate professor of sociology at Pomona College. And we're excited to learn about her new book that she co-authored with Stefan Timmermans, The Unclaimed, Abandonment and Hope in the City of Angels. And before we dive in there, I just wanted to highlight a few of our upcoming events with the Historical Society. So we have, as I mentioned, we have a upcoming, well, first actually, upcoming Marie Northrop lecture. It's a part of our series at the Central Library. That is going to be on June 8th, Sunday, June 8th at 2 p.m. And that is going to be Los Angeles Before the Freeways, Images of an Era, 1850 to 1950, with Nathan Marsack. So it's going to be a really incredible one. I'm excited to see the book. It is a stunning black and white photography by Arnold Hyland. It captures a forgotten era of Los Angeles and has an original essay by the photographer providing historical background and context for that period. And then this new edition also contains additional never before seen photographs from Hyland, as well as newly unearthed information from historian Nathan Marsack. So it's going to be a great one. Again, that'll be Sunday, June 8th at 2 p.m. at the Central Library. And all this info will be on our website, but I'd just like to highlight it. That same day, if you are a very ambitious person as I am and try to do a lot of things in a day. We're also going to, the Historical Society is also going to have a table at the 54th annual LA Pride Parade, happening also on June 8th. The parade starts at 11 a.m. and that's going to be along Highland Boulevard in Hollywood. So east on Hollywood Boulevard and south on Cahuenga. So I believe in you. I think you can do both and maybe take public transportation. I think that'll be easier. And then one more item too is, as I mentioned, an upcoming webinar, Ghosts, a Curse, and Attempted Murder, the History of Griffith Park. That is going to be on Wednesday, June 11th at 7 p.m. And that is going to be with award-winning author and historian Colleen Fieldner. And the talk is going to dive into the history and legends of Griffith Park, as well as the life of Griffith J. Griffith, featured in her latest book, Fascinating True Tales from Old California. That'll be a fun one. So that is our upcoming events. I'll share a link in the chat there at the end so you all can learn more. And we welcome all of our members, and perhaps many of you joined us or signed up for our mailing list at the LA Festival of Books a couple weeks ago. We were really excited for our first table there. So hopefully we saw some of you there. And if you aren't yet a member, we really do encourage you to join. It is really what helps us to offer these webinars and all of our other events as well. We do scholarships for students. We have in-person events, as I mentioned, the Marie Northrop lecture series. I also host tours and other in-person events. And we also, as one of our member perks, have the tour of the LA City Archives, which is just a fantastic opportunity. I go with our city archivist, Mike Holland, who was also our vice president of the society. And you get to tour the city archives and see just incredible documents and maps from LA's history and explore all of that. And that's a members only perk. So recommend you join. And even if you've done it before, it's kind of a fun one to do every once in a while. So with that, I'm excited to hand things over here to Pamela Prickett, and she's going to share with us about her book.
Well, thank you, Danny. I'm honored to be here with you tonight with the Los Angeles City Historical Society. I've spent the better part of 2 decades studying and writing about LA. So it's truly a pleasure to be in the company of people who care about the city and its history. Tonight, I am going to talk about my recently published co-authored book, The Unclaimed, as Danny mentioned. I co-wrote that with a colleague at UCLA. His name is Stefan Timmermans, and he apologizes for not being able to be here tonight. I should say I'm joining you from Claremont, where Pomona College is getting ready for graduation. So hopefully they're not working too late to build the stage outside my office and it gets very noisy. So I'm going to share my screen and bring you into some of the pictures from behind the scenes of doing this work. So I'd like to talk about tonight, not just the contents of the book, but about the research process that went into making it, which was an 8-year labor of love for Stefan and myself. I mean, we're both professors. We both teach about death and dying. We've both written books before we had come to writing this one. But this book pushed us in new ways, and I'd love to share more about that and give you that behind the scenes look. So now, it's important that I state at the start of this talk that I am a sociologist. Oh, there's Stefan. I forgot we had our pictures here. Not the kind that studies numbers, so I won't give you a bunch of numbers, a couple tonight. But I'm the kind of sociologist who studies and teaches about social systems of meaning. So things like religion, culture, interactions, right? And one of my professors in graduate school used to call ethnographers, which is the method I use, kind of the historians and the chroniclers of the everyday. So that's really what I've been focused on. And this project really made me kind of expand into archives, which I'll talk about. I should share that also that I see death as a twofold process because beyond our bodies undergoing a physiological process when we die, our death also sparks a social process in which we ease out of this world and settle safely into the memories of the living. So across cultures and time, this resituating of body and person has occurred through funeral rites, burial, memorialization, personal grief. It is essential to who we are. As the Italian historian Giambattista Vico reminds us, humanitas in Latin comes first and properly from humando, burying. In this way, burying the dead, German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer wrote, is perhaps the fundamental phenomenon of becoming human. Yet, not all of us receive a decent burial. The poor have always been more likely than the wealthy to end up in unmarked graves and so-called potter's fields, the useless pockmarked tracts of land dug up for clay since biblical times. Because the extractions left large holes in the red clay, those barren fields became the place of choice for burying the indigent dead. It's also where social outcasts, wanderers who died far from their homes, and prisoners were buried. I have a picture here of Hart Island in New York, the largest potter's field in America, as well as a news clip from LA in the 1940s. So across time, people have gone to great lengths to avoid these kinds of burials. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as you may know, many poor Americans deprived themselves of life's necessities to pay into burials insurance funds and to avoid the stigma of an unadorned pauper's grave. Freshly landed immigrants joined burial societies, pooling funds in the hope of sending their body to their homelands, or if internment in the quote, right soil was out of reach, at least to be buried in a real cemetery with a proper funeral. By 1938, New York City alone had more than 3,000 Jewish burial societies. Now, indigent souls still end up in common graves across the United States, but now more and more Americans, people of means, people with jobs and homes and families, are ending up in potter's fields. The term of choice for these souls is no longer indigent, but unclaimed, reflective of relatives' inability or unwillingness to take care of their dead. So if you read my book, you will meet Lena Brown. Lena grew up in Los Angeles, the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She had a tight bond with her sisters. She later married and settled in a duplex in Hawthorne. And by many counts, Lena did everything she was supposed to. Even after her husband died, she was able to successfully live an independent life for decades. Now, as I imagine many of us aim to do, right? That kind of truly American independent life. But when she approached 90 and her health started to decline more, she found herself on what became a rather dangerous roller coaster, both with her family who was there and then not, as well as with the institutions we rely on as we age, be it doctors, Medicare, and nursing homes. She went from being middle class to broke, literally penniless within just a few years. And for reasons I don't want to give away, because I want you to be enticed to read the book, it wasn't clear at the time that she died whether or not her family would be there for her to handle her burial. And if they weren't, she would end up here, buried under a single marker like this, her ashes commingled with 1,500 other Angelenos who died that same year. It's this story, along with those of 3 other Angelenos, that we tell at length in the book. 4 people at risk of going unclaimed, people who were loved and cared for in life, but for each of them, for different reasons, ends up on a path that makes their burial uncertain. Now, Stefan and I estimate that between 2 to 4% of the 2.8 million people who die every year in the United States are going unclaimed. So in a non-pandemic year, that's going to be over 114,000 Americans. For perspective, that's roughly how many Americans die annually from diabetes. In LA County in 1976, unclaimed deaths made up 1.2% of adult deaths. That number inched up to 3% by the turn of the century, and it has continued to rise. The increase means that hundreds more residents every year end up in a mass grave. In Maryland, one of the few states to keep track of unclaimed deaths over time, the percentage of people going unclaimed has more than doubled in 20 years, from 2.1% of total deaths in 2000 to 4.5% in 2021. Now, there is no federal agency to track or oversee the unclaimed. It's just a patchwork of ad hoc local practices. And as numbers rise, we face what one well-known genealogist, Megan Smoleniak, has called a quiet epidemic. And it is not just the US. This is increasingly a global problem. So these are some headlines that were taken from news articles about the UK, Germany, South Korea, and Japan. They all point to rising numbers of unclaimed dead elsewhere in the world. In South Korea, for example, the number of unclaimed bodies with known relatives, so they know who the relatives are, went up 83% over the last 3 years. That's according to a 2024 report from the Ministry of Health and Welfare. So why? Why are the numbers of unclaimed deaths rising? That was really the kind of puzzle that Stefan and I set out to understand. But first, I'm going to share a little more about the project and what I did to understand these deaths, but I will answer that question of why. So at this point, I should say most people are drawn in, but they're wondering, how did you come to study this, Pamela? And the answer lies in a mosque in South Central LA. In fact, I was conducting ethnographic research at the mosque for my PhD when one of the community's longtime members, Sister Sherry, passed away. Now, she was estranged from her family of origin at the time of her death, and her body was sitting in the LA County morgue about to be cremated, which was against the community's religious beliefs. So I was sitting in the back of the prayer hall one evening during Ramadan as the head imam implored the community to save Sherry's body. And members heeded the call. They organized a fundraiser to get legal help to claim her body and then to bury her in accordance with Muslim traditions. And it got me thinking, what happens if you die in LA with no family and maybe no religious community? So a quick internet search, as most folks would do, I turned to it and it revealed that there were a handful of stories, including a couple in the Los Angeles Times, features about a county crematorium and cemetery in Boyle Heights. These articles were helpful, but they didn't feed my sociological appetite to understand the underlying causes of unclaimed deaths. And so now, several years later, I'm here to tell you that deeper story. To do so, Stefan and I agreed in 2015, so 10 years ago, to embark on what we thought would be a simple and straightforward project. While we quickly realized that what makes the unclaimed important for study also makes them exceptionally difficult to research. So we spent years seeking answers to really basic questions from the county, like how many unclaimed are there annually and who are they? Partly it was because no one had ever really counted the unclaimed. There are no federal statistics, nor does LA County keep a comprehensive tally, and they certainly don't make it publicly available, which we can talk about. The various agencies that dealt with the unclaimed in LA had their own records, but as we discovered, they tended to underestimate that number. This map, which a data journalist then at the LA Times made and shared with me, shows that unclaimed deaths occur throughout the county. right? A jurisdiction that spans more than 4,000 square miles. So Stefan and I cast a really wide net. We spoke to anyone and everyone we thought might have relevant insights. So we interviewed hospital and prison chaplains, social workers, mortuary directors, journalists, and to understand what made LA unique, we tried to speak to government employees in other counties. We traveled to the US-Mexico border to meet activists advocating on behalf of disappeared migrant bodies. And we came to learn of volunteer groups who organize burials for certain subpopulations of the unclaimed, including infants and veterans. It took us several months of bureaucratic hurdle jumping, but eventually we gained access to the handwritten registers that the County of Los Angeles keeps to document every public burial or cremation. And they've done this since 1896. Now, LA is a little bit odd in that it has three different government agencies that handle the bodies and estates of the unclaimed. One of them is called the Office of Decedent Affairs. The ODA maintains the records that I just mentioned, and which you can see a picture of here. And so there are these beautiful leather-bound registers, which they keep in a fireproof safe in the chapel in the crematorium, and you can see me standing in that chapel. We also interviewed staff there in that office, as well as the medical examiners. We spent 8 months shadowing investigators in that office as they went to death scenes and sat side by side in the cubicles of the coroner staff who handle notifications. We later filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the public administrator. That's the third agency, and it's the one that handles the estates and burials of people with means who die intestate. Now, this research revealed the hidden world of the death care workers tasked with processing unclaimed bodies, as well as the volunteers touched by the phenomenon. But even a couple years into the project, the unclaimed themselves remained an enigma. So to locate their relatives and friends, people who would have known them in life, I trained myself to become an amateur genealogist. I triangulated our list of unclaimed names with dates of birth to identify last known addresses. From there, I tried to track down family members who would be willing to talk. When I found reliable addresses but no phone numbers, I knocked on doors. So residences and places of death for the unclaimed, as well as the homes of friends, families, and neighbors. I'll add that for most of this book, working on this book, I was actually a professor at the University of Amsterdam. So I logged a lot of miles and a horrible carbon footprint coming back and forth between Amsterdam and LA. To locate their relatives and friends, people who would have known them in life, I became an amateur genealogist. And so I'm happy to talk more about this research, and really kind of one of the surprising elements was how willing people were to talk to me about this incredibly sensitive subject. And I am really grateful for people who opened up and shared with me their stories. But suffice it to say, it took a lot of work to get these answers, hundreds of interviews, hours upon hours of shadowing government workers, thousands of miles in the car. And it's this kind of deep reporting that helped us get a fuller picture of what is happening in the county around unclaimed deaths and why I expect that the numbers will continue to rise in the US. So to give you a sense of what the research revealed, I want to take you inside the LA Medical Examiner's Office, which investigates suspicious deaths, so anything violent or unexpected. They also get called in when there is no doctor to sign a death certificate. In cases where someone dies alone at home, the medical examiner often gets a call from local police who may have conducted a welfare check at the call of a neighbor or an apartment manager. And often the death scene investigator only has something like this, literally from, this is Christina McGuire in the picture during COVID. And Christina, we got a chance to follow Christina around. And so we were there with her on one death scene investigation. And all she had was decedent lived in an apartment on Royal Oaks Drive in Monrovia, California, white, male, born 1/22/1942. So investigators are dispatched to the death scene to gather clues that could help them determine who the deceased was and how they died. They're also expected to notify next of kin, and if that isn't possible, to gather information about who might be next of kin. In the book, we take you into one of these investigations. And this chapter, I have to say, is one of my favorites in the book because I feel like we're really able to give you a sense of the work that they do it's distinct from what you would see on TV shows. And once they gather their clues, the investigator heads back to the office. And that's where the work, I think, some of the harder work in some ways, if you can imagine, begins. And this is Joyce. At 50, Joyce was the senior member of the notifications unit, which is holds the job of finding next of kin and calling them and trying to compel them to claim. There's actually a 2003 documentary, A Certain Kind of Death, which you can watch on YouTube if you're interested. And this is from when Joyce was first starting out working in notifications. Her job seemed straightforward. So find the next of kin, notify them of the death, and ask about funeral arrangements. In reality, it involved a complicated mix of genealogical research and persuasion, all while under intense time pressure as cases kept piling up on her desk. So, who qualifies as next of kin was easy to find in the medical examiner's office. Joyce had a chart like this pinned on the wall of her cubicle, showing an abstracted family tree with kinship ties to 26 levels. So here's the picture we took of it, and here we recreated it for easier viewing. The most important person to find was the one designated by the decedent to have power of attorney in health and financial matters. Now, few people designate such a person. Second in line is the spouse or registered domestic partner, followed by adult children. But then, rather than moving on to grandchildren, the tree shoots up vertically to parents, then to siblings, then grandparents, aunts, and uncles. Only then does it move back down to grandchildren, nieces, and nephews, and first, second, and third cousins. This hierarchy reinforces the ties of a nuclear family. So it privileges blood, adoption, or marriage, often at the expense of the quality of the relationship. So the assumption is that the closer the family tie is, the more willingness there will be for some family member to take care of disposition, and that the interests of close relatives take precedence over more remote family members. And it makes two critical assumptions. One, that the next of kin is willing to claim, and two, that the next of kin is able to make disposition arrangements. With the considerable expense of burials and even low-cost cremations, it makes sense that more Americans will decline to claim. So drawing on this next of kin hierarchy, Joyce then goes into the databases. They use any information they can about a decedent to help them locate possible next of kin. In looking for relatives, Joyce followed the branches of the family tree up and down. She frequently used Accurate, an aggregated database of personal information from public and non-public records. It's owned by LexisNexis, and it's one of the databases that law enforcement uses, linking names and addresses and possible relatives or associates. When the search produced a name, the staff and notifications called that person. Quick access to a death certificate is one of the few carrots the medical examiner's office has to entice hesitant families to claim. Every day, the staff are going all across those 4,000 square miles, retrieving dozens of bodies from all corners of the city and the county, and every day they need to sign out a similar number. Falling behind means that the crypt, which is this large, cooled space with metal racks that stack bodies 6 rows high, would overflow. In fact, most relatives were eager to retrieve their loved one's body to organize a funeral in small but a significant way, and repeated thousands of times, the state, through the work of countless government officials, supports and confirms this very particular family conception. As you know, from a genealogical perspective, a person is rarely without next of kin because one can keep tracing that family tree until a living relative of some kind is found. But in reality, the medical examiner's staff often decided they had done sufficient due diligence when they had inquired about immediate relatives. So parents, adult children, siblings, maybe aunts and uncles, of course, spouses. Of 300 coroner cases we systematically examined during those 3 months in the office, so pouring through those records, 51 people went unclaimed because no relative could be found. But this was a relative as defined by the staff's implementation of that standard. What the notification staff are tasked with doing is finding the right person, as interpreted by centuries-old common law. And I just want to highlight that this is a picture that was in one of the cubicles in the notifications office. So we talked to a man who considered himself the deceased brother because they had grown up together and were raised by the same woman who was that man's mother and the deceased's aunt. However, because the men were technically cousins, the man was not notified. He had no way of making arrangements because he didn't know his brother had even died. The staff's compliance with the standard, which privileged official ties rather than qualitative dimensions of a relationship, can render a connection invisible in the eyes of the state and may lead to a deceased going unclaimed. Staff assess who is likely to claim based on proximity to the deceased, de facto excluding some potential next of kin. So Captain John Cadis, who supervised Joyce and the notification staff and scene investigators like Christina explained, whether you call it I can't afford it or abandoned or unclaimed, the situation is that the family has failed to act. Now, according to California state law, if the family does not retrieve the body after 30 days, it is considered abandoned, and the medical examiner coroner's office can legally start the disposition process. In states across the United States, I'm starting to get news alerts that they're even trying to shorten this time frame in many places because they just don't have space to accommodate the numbers of unclaimed bodies. But it was in the medical examiner's office's interest to ensure relatives claimed bodies because county disposition took money out of a strained budget and taxed an already understaffed office, and this was before the current budget predicament that the city is in. But the state's expectation that relatives will bury their loved ones no matter what clashes with the reality that many family ties are simply strained beyond repair. We've found widespread estrangement in the coroner files, in probate records, and through interviews with next of kin. According to one recent national survey, 1 in 4 adult Americans reports currently being estranged from a relative. So on paper, these families are still a unit. But from the next of kin's perspective, letting the decedent go unclaimed may seem a more appropriate reflection of the actual relationship. We wanted to then kind of quantify this a little bit more to understand who are the unclaimed. And we worked with a demographer to analyze 40 years of unclaimed cremation records. We found that men are 70% more likely to be what the county calls county disposition, so to be an indigent cremation. White Angelenos make up the largest group of LA's unclaimed in terms of overall numbers, but Black Angelenos go unclaimed at higher rates. People who died in middle age, so 35 to 54, were more likely to end up unclaimed than other age groups. The demographic patterns point to a common risk factor: social isolation caused by eroding family ties. So take the gender differences we found. The men most at risk for ending up unclaimed are unmarried or divorced. Women have their own risks. Never getting married is riskier than divorce when it comes to having someone to claim. Women are also more likely to outlive their spouses, leaving fewer people to claim them. The racial differences in going unclaimed can also be explained in part by shifting family ties. Although households of all racial compositions are fragmenting, the decline of traditional families is most common among white Americans, and the association between family isolation and going unclaimed is significantly stronger for white than for Black LA residents. The risk of social isolation also accounts for age differences. So as if people like myself in middle age don't have enough existential angst already, demographic research shows that we are one of the fastest growing segments of the population without nuclear family ties. In our research, we found that friends and relatives who fell outside the next of kin hierarchy feared legal retribution if they tried to sidestep the family's rights to disposition, meaning people are going unclaimed because the law does not recognize the best person maybe to be doing the claiming. Recall how I told you I got into this project. It turns out that Sister Sherry's case was exceptional. It almost never happens in LA that once someone is on the path towards going unclaimed, that non-family reverse the course. I thus came to the project through kind of one of the rarest of cases. So what happens to those people and the 4 people who are at risk in our book of going unclaimed and the sort of 2,000 who are facing going unclaimed every year in LA? So if family or religious community do not step in to organize a funeral, the county must do it. The growing number of us in LA at risk of going unclaimed face 3 possible outcomes when it comes to a county planned funeral. The first is what the county calls an indigent burial. So this is a picture from a ceremony just before it got started a couple of years ago. So every December, it used to be the first or second Wednesday. They've now moved it to a Thursday. They hold this public event at the Los Angeles County Cemetery, which is tucked away in a corner of Evergreen and Boyle Heights. And they have this really beautiful 35-minute interfaith ceremony, although this year it did get a little longer, more politicians were speaking. Um, and and it's organized by Father Chris Panett, who is a Catholic priest and a chaplain at the county hospital. He runs the chaplaincy program, and so he's been kind of trying to step up, having this burial in the common grave. So what happens in LA? They cremate you, and then they store your cremains for up to 3 years to give families the chance who maybe were caught off guard or need additional time to put together money to claim the cremains. At the end of those 3 years, if they're still stored in the county crematorium, they bring all of the cremains together and they inter it in this kind of patch of land under a single marker. Remember, I showed you that year. So that's what happens if you die in LA without assets and without family. If someone dies in LA County and they're a veteran without assets, they get a burial, military burial at Riverside National Cemetery. And in the book, we take you into how this group got started. It was actually through Joyce's old boss, a man by the name of Doyle Tolbert, who was a veteran himself. He had worked in the medical examiner's office for many years, and he implemented a process to check that every person who was coming through the medical examiner's office was, assessed for whether or not they were a veteran, so that they could get their rights to a military burial. So they meet every Wednesday, rain or shine, in Riverside. And for those of us who die without assets, but have no, who die with assets, but have no family willing to organize a funeral, they will receive a public administrator organized, packaged private funeral. And so this is from one, it lasted about 7 minutes. It was just the hired priest, the cemetery workers, myself and Stefan at this particular funeral. It would have cost at that time in 2017 just over $10,000. And the public administrator will then take that money out of the estate along with other expenses for handling the probate. And then whatever money is left will go to the next of kin. So remember, I said you can keep searching that family tree and you'll find family. Turns out they become very active when money is involved, but maybe not so much with disposition. So similar to how policymakers rely on life expectancy as a snapshot of the overall health of a population, Stefan and I argue that the rate of unclaimed offers a sensitive barometer of the strength of family ties. It tells us about what we think we owe each other in our most vulnerable moments. At the same time, as we show in the book, there are people responding to the rise in unclaimed deaths, volunteers who are devoting themselves to providing dignity to the marginalized among us, people who are coming together amid the worst deaths to reaffirm a sense of humanity. And that's the plea I want to make for you to read the book. So see where there is hope among the abandonment, and why hope is in the subtitle. And this, I mentioned Father Chris, we talk about him. I mentioned Doyle Tolbert. And there's also this group, Garden of Innocence, out of San Diego, which has then spread throughout California and the West Coast, and they organize for unclaimed infants. And so, yeah, these communities are coming together. In the case of the Garden of Innocence, what we found is that many people are suffering themselves from unresolved grief, sometimes things that happened in their past many decades ago, and they have this opportunity to come together and to honor the unclaimed, and through it also work through some of their own grief. So thank you so much. I'm going to kind of stop there, stop sharing my screen, and get to the really fun part, which is to answer any questions that folks may have for me.
Thank you so much, Pamela. That was great. So yeah, if folks want to use the Q&A section there, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's the Q&A, or if you're more familiar with the chat, that's fine too. I will relay the questions to Pamela. Maybe as we're waiting for those, I'll maybe start off. I think first of all, I also endorse everyone grabbing a copy of Pamela's book. It's really just just it's hard to say a fantastic read, but it is enlightening and just revealing in uh, parts of dealing with death that we
Mhm.
don't, I think, typically think about from day to day. I think one of the things that really stood out to me is that it's, yes, of course, about death, but I think it's also very much about the living. And I feel like you and Stefan did a wonderful job at really humanizing it, and in a
Mm,
way that's telling the stories both of the deceased and sort of giving them this full color to their lives and to the people in their lives. I think it's they're each one is complex, and but it's not just as clear cut as, oh, they just the family abandoned that. There's complexity to it,
mhm,
which
mhm,
I think was really great. And then, of course, as you mentioned too, all of the people involved in the city and the county of working to try and track down the family members. I mean, I think it's um, there's just so much about sort of the celebration of the living, I think, too,
mhm.
that's there.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think just to sort of two things I'm thinking about as you were saying that. Thank you, by the way, for the compliments of the book. I should tell people it's not written like this talk was. You don't see any of those pictures, and you don't get a lot of that kind of exposition, we call it. It's mostly narrative, right? Through the lives of the people. But first of all, I would say, and I see the question from Robin. I love your question because this is the one I always ask my students when they're doing their research projects. What surprised me the most? And it connects to something you said, Danny. I think one surprise, one pleasant surprise, I think, is that unclaimed doesn't mean unmourned. And I think there's a lot of pushback, even sometimes, about using the term unclaimed. Even people we write about in the county who don't want to have any attention to this because they don't want to have the ceremony, they don't want to publish the list because they think there's something kind of implicitly shameful. But I think Stefan and I, it was really important to us that we show people that the unclaimed doesn't mean unmourned. We tell the story of Midge. Inez Midge Gonzalez, and she chose the name. She gave herself the nickname Midge, and you know, she had a lot of struggles, like a lot of people in Los Angeles. She had housing precarity issues. She had, employment struggles, um, and she was living in her van for many, many years. And by all accounts, was not always the easiest person to get along with. I mean, at this point, I probably know more about Midge than most people in her life did because I've talked to so many different people. But every single person we talked to about Midge cried. Years later, they teared up just thinking about her, thinking about the last time she kind of got under their skin, or thinking about the last time she, who had very little, would bring food to people who had more than her because it was her joy to give. And I think I'm trying to remember more and more these days that we are all at our heart really good people. And so I actually sometimes think reading the book reminds me there are really good people who care for strangers, care for their families for whatever reason. Circumstances take different turns. I think the other thing that surprises me, and this might be as a result of things that have happened since the book came out, is how difficult it is to get the county to release information. It should not have taken years, and you know, at one point, the LA Times had to get attorneys involved when they just wanted to get access to these records years ago, and it shouldn't be that way. Our if you want to do the kind of where it's taxpayer money that goes towards that, you could do that, but it's also just like, why not share this information? Why not make the lists public so that people have the chance to find a loved one to claim and step in those 3 years? If you don't make it publicly available, they won't know. And so we got to tell four amazing stories, but they're four. And there's so many more people who deserve to have their stories known. And so surprised, frustrated, and trying to maintain hope that we can keep pushing the city to make records more publicly accessible.
And was there anything, I think you had mentioned, was it Maryland that does have that kind of
Yes,
list?
yes. So Maryland is one of the few states that tracks this at that state level. And we spoke, with the person who he's a doctor who's overseeing the agency that does that. And so he made it available. And so by tracking it, you can see the trends. Like Japan is way ahead of the US in terms of counting its number of unclaimed. I think last year was at 3.7% of deaths in Japan. And they're having a national conversation about this because, yeah, they know it's a problem.
Yeah, amazing. That's only the one state. I'd just be curious why they're.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's, a Cook County in Chicago releases information. Pima County in Arizona and Tucson, they're fantastic. I went to the Tucson Festival of Books a couple of months ago, and I gave a talk, and I didn't know it at the time, but a bunch of folks from the Pima County Medical Examiner's Office were in the audience and came up to me at the book signing, and were saying that, they felt bad for LA, that this is how we chose to do things. So it's not to say that that everywhere is doing what LA is doing. And in many ways, LA is better than other places. We heard stories that were really horrible stories, like at the county that's at the border between California and Mexico. Last time I checked, they were still doing this. I would need to double check it, but they were cremating unidentified remains, which are automatically going to go unclaimed. And they were driving them to San Diego to scatter the ashes at sea, which meant you had no DNA left. And so that is like, to me, that's way worse than, I mean, so yeah.
Yeah, wow. So I have a lot of great questions coming in here. Um, uh, what is a situation where an infant would be unclaimed?
Mhm.
And where can I buy a book?
Yeah. So to the first question, what's happening when infants go unclaimed? So there are, let's say, 2,000 who go unclaimed in an indigent unclaimed deaths in Los Angeles, and anywhere from about 150 to 200 will be considered infant deaths. Now, often what that is a stillbirth or a miscarriage beyond 20 weeks gestation. So the state of California requires after 20 weeks gestation that a fetus have a fetal burial permit and be processed like a body rather than as medical waste or something which might be prior to those 20 weeks. And so a lot of times they're mothers who are in the hospital, they're overwhelmed or they've got other problems, other situations and struggles they're dealing with. And so, those become the hospital transfers them to the LA County so that they can be, handled. There are the Garden of Innocence. I would say they do have, really tragic stories of babies and young children who died really violent deaths, but overwhelmingly, it's going to be fetal remains past 20 weeks gestation. And when it comes to buying the book, you can get it anywhere that you can buy a book. So bookshop, your local bookstore, you can order it through Bookshop's website, Amazon, Barnes& and Noble. We have it as an audiobook, ebook, and hardback.
Thank you. Um, from Carrie Moore, to what extent do you think the sheer expense of the American funeral led to abandonment?
Yeah, so I think, I keep going back to Robin's question. This is also something that surprised me. So I really thought, because I had been studying urban poverty and religion and urban inequality for a while, I came into the story thinking it was going to be much more about finances, that it was going to be the really high cost of a funeral. I will tell you that was not the go-to answer in most cases for the relatives that I spoke to. Um, Now, where it comes into play is, let's say adult siblings haven't spoken in decades. They had a falling out or they were never that close, they haven't spoken, and you get a call from the medical examiner's office. Or you haven't spoken to your uncle in 40 years. You get a call from the medical examiner's office, he died in a nursing home. Then you start to think, well, I mean, I understand that you haven't spoken to this person in 40 years. is spending $8, $9, $10,000, which is the average cost of a funeral in the United States. Does that make sense? Am I the right person to be doing this, right? So I think it comes into play in combination with other factors. Yeah.
Um, Jerry, you wrote quite a bit about the struggle to keep the annual ceremony going with apathy and sometimes opposition from the hospital or county officials. Do you think the tradition has become strong enough that these ceremonies will continue in LA without a fight? What about other counties and stuff?
Hmm. Well, thank you. You obviously read the book, Jerry, so thank you for that. Um, I don't know what I think, to be honest, about the viability of this tradition being strong enough that it will continue beyond the individuals like Father Chris. I think Father Chris has created an infrastructure where his chaplains will continue this. But, the chaplaincy program depends on donations. It's run through the St. Camilla's Spiritual Center. Um, so we're relying on philanthropy for that program to keep going. And when it comes to the county, this is we're going to be facing a lot of budget cuts. And so, all things considered, it's a really small expense. The Office of Decedent Affairs does not have a very big budget. It's like less than 1% of the county's budget, less than 0.5% of the county's budget. To do the ceremony is really not expensive at all. It's almost like this last year was a little bit more pomp and circumstance than I'd ever experienced before. But prior to that, been really kind of like a mom and pop sort of operation, which I really liked. Um, so I don't think that cost should be used as an excuse because I don't think it's a real one. But whether it will get used, I'm skeptical. I mean, I think it will take pressure from constituents. It will take county board supervisors. So Janice Hahn has been going every year. When she's done and her term ends, will her successor take this on? She had followed after Don Kanabe to go, and he's the one who kind of helped get this ceremony going. So it does take the efforts of individuals who find this is important, and it takes people showing up. So I've been really touched by the fact that, maybe some of the same folks who are here with us tonight would be interested in going. And the last couple of years you had to get on Eventbrite and you had to get a ticket, and it sold out. I mean, it's free, but it sold out in like minutes. They don't, they won't turn you away, I don't think, if you don't have the ticket. Don't tell them I said that. Of course, this goes on forever in YouTube, but so I think there's enough public interest if we keep talking about it and everybody knows it's a part of our history. It's a part of the fabric of the city. Keep sharing it with people. Even just going once in your lifetime and getting a neighbor to go once or a friend to go once, that's enough to help keep this going. But it does take us, right? It takes us showing up and being present for those and being the strangers who care for the unclaimed.
Definitely. We have a question from Colleen, our next month's speaker.
Mm.
When do you think the unclaimed began to be cremated rather than buried? I read the history book on Los Angeles Poor Farm. Indigent poor were buried in caskets in the county cemetery at the Poor Farm. Um, but when a flood washed away the caskets away, leaving the corpses scattered in a large area,
Mhm.
and had to be reburied.
Yes. So, Colleen, I can't wait for your talk and to learn more about the Los Angeles Poor Farm. So it started Los Angeles. Interestingly enough, we don't always get enough of the good reputation for being ahead of the East Coast, but the county started doing cremations in the early 1920s, which was not, it was not, most people in America were not getting cremated, right? That just has been a more recent phenomenon where the tide shifted. So they've been doing cremation for a very long time. Now, while they're ahead of the game in that regard of the kind of death technology, it was because of land and very early on land scarcity and this kind of back and forth they had with Evergreen to kind of, in order for Evergreen to build their cemetery, they had to deed some of the land to the county, or at that time the city. But then the city sold some of it back to Evergreen. So now it's a much smaller pocket, and they knew early on that they were going to need to maximize as much space as possible.
And the Evergreen, just in general, is a unique
Mm,
uh, cemetery in LA. Um, oh, you mentioned, when we sort of were briefly talking beforehand, just how the book sort of changed you
mm.
in ways. What was sort of, some of those shifts in terms of maybe your perspective on death or, you know, just at large?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, many different ways. First of all, I'm nicer to my daughter because I know that she's the one who's going to claim me. Um, I think, I mentioned to you, Danny, before we started that I was really trying to get back to LA and Southern California. And it's, in part because of this book, not just writing it and wanting to be here for research. And it was just sort of feeling that I was quite isolated in Amsterdam. I lived in this kind of expat community that had a lot of turnover, very far from family and childhood friends, my own chosen families. And I felt, there was just, I think there was a lot more of myself I saw in the book than I realized I would at the start. And so I made some life choices so that I could be back in America and closer to family and close friends. I think it also, it's been interesting really to teach this book to 18, 19, 20-year olds, and just to sort of to see how they react to it. They feel very strongly, as I think I do as well, about there's something fundamentally flawed if chosen family and close friends cannot be brought into this process. Um, it's just, it shocks them, right? And so I think, you know, we like to legalize everything here, but maybe there's, in terms of like, we like to individualize everything as on you to figure out the legal dimensions, but maybe there could be some sort of movement I would like to see where we kind of work to expand notions of who counts as next of kin and who counts as viable for the county to allow to handle a disposition. And I think that's just a larger kind of, I just want to see more care. I saw such beautiful care of people, volunteers and friends and neighbors. And I want more of that in our city and our country. And so I think that it would be really great if we codified that.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that's one thing that really stood out to me in the book too, is some of the statistics and as far as um, the low percentage of people with wills and just with sort of end of life preparations.
Hmm.
Um, that it just, I mean, like again, like you said, personally is one of those things, like, just kind of uh,
Yeah.
it can be a wake up, but but yeah, it seems like it would be something that would be important for people to discuss more openly and address.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know that I was, I mean, for example, my daughter has been listening to me talk about death in a non-scary way since she was a little kid at the dining table, right? It's just a part of the conversation. So I see this book as fitting in a larger kind of ethos of the positive death movement, where by talking about death, we minimize some of that fear and confusion. And, I did this sort of exercise in my class. I was teaching death and dying this last semester, and I did this exercise where I put the students into groups and I gave them case studies. You've just had a family member in X town pass away suddenly, and you're in charge of organizing the funeral. Okay, go. And they just Googled it and like went with Yelp, like what was the best ranked funeral home. And it's just like, okay, but that's the point. We don't know because we haven't been talking about it, right? Um,
Right.
they didn't know the law. They didn't know about places to go where you're supposed to, by law, be able to get a price sheet. But most funeral homes and mortuaries still do not put these publicly available on their websites or make them easily accessible. You have to go through too much effort. So it's just too much is hidden. And I do think we need to talk about these things a lot more, if for no other reason than logistically. You don't want to be overwhelmed if you're put in the position of organizing something after a sudden death.
Yeah. Absolutely. We have just another question here. Do you have specifics on where we can attend ceremonies of the burials? You mentioned St. Camilla's and Father Chris. What else? And Garden of Innocence. Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah, so LA County will have their annual burial. They call it the annual burial for the unclaimed in December. And they're always it's it takes a bit of time, but you can check probably around November on different websites for the county to get access to that. The Garden of Innocence, you can go to our books website and we have some of the links for these places. And if anyone's interested in attending or organizing something for the unclaimed, we have a few kind of tips there. Um, the Garden of Innocence has a website. They've got different gardens in not Los Angeles, but the closest ones would be Orange County and Ventura County, as well as San Diego and up in the north of the state. And so they're ad hoc. So it's just when they have it makes sense from a logistical standpoint to organize a funeral for the babies or the infants.
drop the link in from your uh, website there. Grab.
And I'm sure Father Chris would appreciate you all visiting the St. Camillus Spiritual Center's website and learning more about what they do. He just had his annual banquet not long ago, and he's really a wonderful person. Read the book for just him because we tell this we told this story at the banquet. My co-author told the story that when we were writing about Father Chris, our editor said he's too perfect. To make a good character, you need more tension. They need flaws. And so we had to work on finding this saintly Catholic priest's flaws,
Mm.
which, we couldn't really find them. Maybe he's too forgiving. I don't know. That might be the most we could do for tension, but he's truly a lovely person. And even the vets who we don't necessarily share the same politics, they're a fun bunch. And I've spent a lot of time with them. I've been out to Riverside a few times since the book came out. You can attend any of those. There's actually probably more than any other group across the country. There are burials and ceremonies for unclaimed veterans. And they're often called Veterans Without Family. So if you search for that online, you can find details.
Note there from
Yeah,
Jerry.
I
County can be
support.
bad about promptly announcing the
Yeah,
ceremony.
yeah. I'm not on social media anymore, so I can't tell you that I'll be announcing it, but maybe I should pursue the LA Times to make sure they publish something a little bit earlier.
No.
I agree. I agree with you, Jerry.
Yeah, I found it because I've wanted to go in the past and it just usually sneaks up like
Yeah.
that. Do you think, as far as, I mean, obviously, for the book you focused on LA, but I'd just be curious, sort of thinking of LA as a city, if there was something, as I say, as a city that many people often come to for
Mhm.
a variety of reasons. Um, if there's maybe something sort of distinctive about the Unclaimed of Los Angeles
Mm.
that maybe sets it apart from other cities based on its culture and history.
Yeah, I like that question a lot. I don't think I've gotten that one in exactly that way. I'm just sort of going off sort of immediate reactions to the question. I think, we're a city of dreamers. We're a city where people come to be stars and to make it big. And I think there is um, maybe that draw, that pull here, which might lead to some kind of estrangement or just a sort of disconnection because somebody moves out here, they take on a different life than they did from the past. I think that's a kind of fair way to think about some of the stories and the cases we encountered. Um, I think, it's a city that has community. It's also a city that struggles a lot with fragmentation. And so, there were some people who, I don't know, it was quite lonely. to look at their lives. It was hard to see, to go into their homes as we did when they had passed and died alone, and to know that they were right next to another house or an apartment building. And I got to think that maybe that you wouldn't exactly have that same kind of alienation if you were in a smaller town or if you were in a city where people, knew their neighbors more. Where I think, and I'm going to get into sociologist mode here, but structurally, the housing problems that we have, the affordability crisis, means that there's a lot more instability. And as we move, it's harder and harder to get to know neighbors and be part of communities. And so I think religious communities are really important as kind of to tether people to a community, whether or not they move. But to know your neighbors is maybe becoming less common in Los Angeles than it used to be. Now I've lived elsewhere in America, and I think that's true in other big cities. But I do think our particular kind of insecurity around housing now is making this potentially more of a concern I would have.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and one of the things I know we're kind of it's getting late here in the evening. I'll let people go. But yeah, just thinking about the book and in particular Evergreen Cemetery, I was thinking of, there's a lot of sort of big LA names on some of the tombstones there.
Mm,
Walk around, you see
mhm,
familiar names that you've seen on street
mhm,
names, and it's
mhm,
the a lot of the history of LA there. Um, and I just think it's an interesting juxtaposition to think about, particularly as we are the historical society, thinking about the stories that are told about these names that we know and the histories that we know. But I also feel like, a very important question is what stories aren't being told. And I feel
mhm,
like, you've done a wonderful job at sort of opening that up and raising that question.
mm,
So I think that's I don't know, for me a great takeaway from it.
mm. Well, thank you. I think it certainly was an objective of the book is to sort of tell these stories and to make people curious to learn these hidden narratives, hidden stories that I really think that the story of LA is it pours out of those handwritten registers. You see migration waves, you see pandemics, you see, riots and rebellions, you see, I mean, just the privilege I had to be able to go and to look at those and to touch those pages and to touch those leather-bound books and to know that this city has so much rich history that doesn't get told. Um, but those are souls that are resting forever in that corner in Boyle Heights. And so maybe even just going there and having a moment of reverence and peace and honor is a way of acknowledging that history in a sort of, very real, visceral way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has joined us this evening. This has been recorded. So if you missed any portion of it or know someone who would enjoy listening to it, we'll be sharing that. It'll go out. Since you've registered, you'll receive an email, but it'll also be on our website, our YouTube page. Um, so once again, Pamela, thank you so much for having us.
Thank
Very
you. Thank you to everybody for your
informative.
awesome questions and your compliments. And Colleen, you can reach me, you can find me on Pomona's website.
So thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.